Welcome to The Lubber's Hole, a Patrick O'Brien podcast. You are with Ian.
And with Mike.
And Mike and I are rereading a chapter at a time our favourite series of nautical novels, the Aubrey Maturin series of Patrick O'Brien. Mike, we are at the beginning of another great book here. Tell us, please, how we came to be here and what's in store for us this week.
Oh, I'd be delighted to. Thanks, Ian. As we closed out Post Captain last week with part 2 of chapter 14, Stephen rejoined the Lively as a temporary post captain, and Jack received secret orders to join a squadron. A storm scattered the squadron as they hurried to intercept Spanish treasure ships. After talks failed, much to Stephen's dismay, the Spanish ships opened fire. One Spanish ship blew up in the battle. Jack took another and then caught the treasure ship after a long chase. The Spanish captains joined Jack and Stephen in toasting Sophia as the book ended. Well, this time, a new First Lord and Admiralty board shake up the story and endanger Stephen, who at the time is checking in on the ladies of Mapes. Stephen's intelligence gathering extends to a private war, we hear, and we start to plumb the depths of his feelings. There's a secondhand Diana update. Jack is nowhere to be seen, and Stephen sets off on a new mission, which worries Sir Joseph.
Wow. A new mission, huh?
A new mission.
Oh, Mike, I'm really looking forward to this book. Not only because it's one of the greats. It's one of the books that people recommend. If you're not going to start with Master and Commander, people recommend starting with this one. And because we are continuing directly on from where we were at the end of Post Captain, with all of these great character arcs still open for us. We're going to see here now what's going to happen in Chapter 1 and where are our heroes and heroines going to be taken. Now, you might expect that we'd open with a bit of exposition with, I don't know, Jack and Sophie standing on a headland looking out to sea, or, you know, Stephen drowning his sorrows in the grapes in the Savoy. But no, the book opens in the Admiralty. To begin with, none of our heroes, none of our principal characters are, as you might say, in shot. So we're going to have to learn a little bit indirectly about what's happening here. We are in a meeting of the Admiralty Board of something or other. And Sir Joseph Blaine, the head of intelligence, is telling the First Lord of the Admiralty and the board that prize money, even the remotest chance of making a fortune by a brilliant stroke, is an unparalleled spur to the diligence, he calls it diligent activity and unremitting attention of every man afloat. In other words, to the Navy itself. And I don't think anybody would have expected Sir Joseph Blaine to be the world's favorite advocate for prize money, but he's doing a fantastic job, and it raises the question in our minds: wait, hold on. This was going to be, a $1 million payout for our heroes. Already, we wonder what's going on. Now, Sir Joseph wants to grab the presumption that what he calls the serving members of the board, that is to say, all the fellows around the table wearing blue, that they will all agree. And in fact, some of them do. Some of them are hedging a little bit. They stare down at their blotting paper, and besides the serving naval members, there are civilian members who have what O'Brien calls a stuffed, non-committal air. Sounds like O'Brien has sat in on a few meetings with civil servants. This is not the usual closed or restricted session of the Lords Commissioners of the Admiralty, but the first, what you might call plenary session. O'Brien calls it, in sort of slightly dodgy dog Latin, he calls it an omnium gatherum, a gathering of everyone, loosely. It's the first omnium gatherum, as he calls it, of the new administration. The first since, the departure of Lord Melville. Come back to him in a second. And the first that now includes several new members, some new heads of department, representatives of other boards, all feeling each other out. And there is an air of political caution, political restraint. Now, Mike, Sir Joseph is trying, for reasons that will become clear to us in a second, if they're not already clear, to make the case here. But he's got more than just any old set of blue suits around the table with him, right?
He does. You know, he's got this new First Lord who seems to be displaying what O'Brien calls a tepid unwillingness. And so Blaine is thinking, okay, I'm not getting there. I thought this might be easier. Well, an example, Blaine explains, an example like this stimulates the zeal of the whole fleet through years of hardship. But denial of this will have the contrary effect. So now we're like, okay, wait, all right, this is it. Denial, what? And we have Admiral Hart at the table. Oh, we don't like, no. We remember from Master and Commander and Post Captain this, schism between Hart and Jack. Well, O'Brien says that Admiral Hart sucks up. No, O'Brien would never say that. He says that, Admiral Hart bends his head obsequiously, but we get it. He sucks up to the First Lord, saying Blaine is not right in attributing such self-interested motives to naval officers. Yeah. And the other naval officers, all of them now pop their heads up. They're all taken aback. They're thinking, oh my God, are you kidding me? Hart's the most self-interested officer they've ever known. He'll snap up anything, any fishing boat, anything solely for the prize money. He's going to say that we don't do it for the prize money. No. Well, the First Lord still isn't buying it. He says, my hands are bound by precedent. He says, consider the case of the Santa Brigida. And his private secretary leans over, whispers into his ears. He says, the Thetis. The Thetis. By Admiralty law, he says, a prize taken before the declaration of war becomes droits. And this was so fun to type because, my spell checker kept saying droids. They become droids of the crown. These are the droids you want. No, we don't want, right? Now they become droids of the crown. And Blaine argues that, well, there's kind of the letter of the law, but there's also, equity, there's natural justice, and that's what sailors are all about. He says, think about this. They knew Spain was about to enter the war against Britain. We knew that with this intelligence coup. They followed Admiralty orders to detain a superior Spanish force. This is, the odds were against them. They were fired upon first. So then, whether war or not, they've been fired upon. And with determined action and grievous loss, sunk one of the Spanish ships and captured 4 others, bringing home 5 million pieces of aid. Well, this now sets 100 hairs running in the room. Everyone's like, wait, 5 million pieces of aid? Largest prize ever. Wait. And so Blaine goes on, not awarding prize money, the custom of the service. I can almost hear Jack saying the immemorial custom. The immemorial service, right. Will have a deplorable effect throughout the fleet. A civilian starts to say, but the action was before a declaration of war. And Admiral Parr, one of the men in blue, who hasn't spoken up quite yet, cuts him off saying, what about the Belle Poule in 78? And so, now the meeting is heating up. I think, if somehow Sir Joseph had hit these points earlier, we might have had a little bit of a different outcome. But we're waiting to see what happens, right?
Right. And we remember talking at the end of the previous book about how this action to take the Spanish treasure ships was rooted in the real world, and the references that O'Brien's making here are references to real actions. Santa Brigida and Thetis were Spanish frigates that had been carrying 2 million silver dollars. It's about 64.5 million UK pounds in 2024 in 1799. The Thetis, the first of these two, had been taken by the Royal Navy by HMS Ithalian, having fled from HMS Naiad, who had been blockading the port of Vigo in Spain. The Santa Brigida had split off and was pursued by Naiad, by Triton and Alcmene, who took her the next morning. And our old friend and benefactor, Anthony Gary Brown, in his excellent book, the Patrick O'Brien Muster book, says that both of these Spanish ships, loaded with treasure, were condemned as lawful prizes and had provided the capturing crews with 10 years' pay and had made their officers wealthy for life. And that's clearly what everybody was hoping for with respect to Jack and the other captains and the other crews here. Now, according to Anthony Gary Brown, in history, there was no doubt about the legitimacy of these actions, and this prize money payout had turned out to be one of the largest in the history. In the aftermath, sailors had been seen walking the streets of Portsmouth with banknotes stuck in their hats, and had issued laws commanding each other to only go out and be seen wearing gold-laced hats. However, despite the apparent historical good news about the Santa Brigida and the Thetis, there is historical precedent for treasure being seized and for the subsequent decision that was made by the Admiralty in post-capture. And also, by the way, in the Hornblower timeline, exactly the same things happens in Hornblower. At the Battle of Cape Santa Maria in 1804, which is the action that we're talking about here, an even larger haul was indeed captured, but the Admiralty, just like we're seeing here, had used an obscure regulation to seize the bulk of the prize, and the captains only received about £15,000 each. Now, £15,000 in 1804 is not a mean sum at all, and this all dated back apparently to a law of 1708, as we've heard, describing these seizures as droits of the crown. For exactly the same reason that we've heard about in the meeting here, that it being that technically the two sides were not at war at the time of the seizure. There had been this ex gratia payment, as that is to say, a payment out of gratitude, a goodwill payment, amounting to these £15,000 each, £150,000, I think, in total. So, if you've been following Jack Aubrey's parlous financial situation, you'll know that this is not necessarily disaster for him, because I think he's £11,000 in the hole right now following the collapse of his prize agent. But compared to what it could have been, the fortune that it might have set up, that might have allowed Jack to be able to settle a decent dowry for the hand of Sophie before Mother Williams, we are not really there. Mike, there was one other quick reference. If I'll just grab that one. The Belle Poule was a French ship that had inflicted damage on an English frigate back in 1778, again happening before war broke out. And it inspired this very fashionable Regency coiffure, this headdress hairstyle that had a pile of curled and powdered hair on top of a woman's head, topped with an elegant model of this ship, including sails and flags. Mike, I don't know whether to be triggered now by my memory of Blackadder or Bridgerton, as I'm imagining this really fancy.
Nice. Or a great combination of the two. Well done.
Yeah,
absolutely. Oh, gosh.
Anyhow, back to the meeting room, hey?
Well, Sir Joseph says that the men on the ships had nothing to do with declarations of war. That's not them. They carried out their duty at no small cost to themselves and at great benefit to the country. The impact on the Navy and on the men who reasonably believe themselves to be beyond want and have no doubt committed themselves accordingly will be, and Blaine's trying to, think of a word that's going to have the right impact. And the Rear Admiral of the Blue says, lamentable, deplorably bad, unsatisfactory. And Sir Joseph said, right word. And Sir Joseph adds, well, wait, you've cited some precedents, but there are other precedents that point in opposite directions. None of this has been tried in a court of law, so it's a discretionary matter for the board. He says, using this gift from the enemy, it's not our money, it's the enemy's money, in favor of the officers and men will repay its expense 100-fold. So he's, I thought it was a nice summation there.
Yeah. You would think so.
Right.
But it seems like he's not really managing to land his point here. When we get into particulars, then things start to get a little bit uneasy. I think Sir Joseph was doing fine with the general, but now the First Lord asks who the officers are who are involved. Captains Sutton and Graham and Collins and Aubrey are the names that are given to him by his secretary. At this point, with the naming of Jack Aubrey, Sir Joseph knows that the game is up. Aubrey and also Sutton are politically anathema to the present administration, to the Whiggish administration that's now in power. The other two themselves have no influence of any kind. There's no real balancing of the political scales here. The First Lord's going, Aubrey, who's he? And his secretary tells him that Jack is the son of the troublesome parliamentarian General Aubrey, the one who quotes his own son whilst accusing the administration of corruption while he's on his feet in the House of Commons. So, one black mark already behind the First Lord's political considerations here. It gets worse, though, because the First Lord then rather gauchily, out loud, taps one of the names here and says, what about this Dr. Maturin? And we know that Stephen Maturin was given an honorary captain's rank as part of this expedition. So Joseph tries to sort of blow it over. He says, oh yeah, he's the man I sent you a minute about last week. He emphasizes the one in the yellow cover, kind of nudge, nudge, kicking him under the table. And O'Brien says that this nudge, nudge emphasis would have been the equivalent of throwing an inkwell at the head of Lord Melville. So this is clearly a First Lord who's not very receptive to subtle signals. The First Lord, forgetting the yellow cover, which presumably signifies that it's a secret matter, says, is it usual then for a medical man to be given a temporary post-captain's commission? And this gets the attention of everybody else around the table, especially the serving men. Blaine says, he kind of blows a bit of sort of obscurity over it. We did it for Sir Joseph Banks. We did it for Edmund Halley, he of the Comet fame. And seeing the cold and wary stare that he's now getting from Sir Joseph, the First Lord realizes that he's made a bit of a gaffe and says, so this Maturin, nothing to do with this particular case? Nothing at all, says Sir Joseph. And Blaine goes on trying to make amends here, saying Captain Aubrey's views do not represent his son's views, and hopes to sort of draw attention away from this gaffe of the naming of Stephen Maturin. Still, remember, among all these serving officers around the table, we have our old friend Admiral Hart, and he sees an opportunity not only to stick the boot in on Captain Aubrey, but to suck up a little bit, to curry some favour. Would it be in order, he asks, to call upon Sir Joseph to declare a personal interest? And Admiral Parr, who's one of the older, more senior admirals around the table, his face goes purple and he says, it would not. A most improper suggestion. And I love the kind of coughing, grunting, muttering that we get here. Infernal presumption, new member, Rear Admiral, little shit. Which is excellent. I'll try to remember to use that in a Teams call one day.
Right.
So Joseph says, truthfully, he can say he has never met this Captain Aubrey, and that he, Sir Joseph, is serving only the good of the service. And we get the real motivation behind Hart's attack here. Hart was shocked by the reception of what he had thought was a rather clever remark, and he instantly pulled in his horns that had been planted among a grove of others by the Captain Aubrey in question. He means Cuckold's horns, meaning that Hart's wife has been unfaithful with Jack Aubrey, as we know. He confounded himself in apologies, and so this little Captain Hart episode tails off. Mike, it's funny, it's really great writing, and it's a very efficient way to catch us up on the backstory, especially the reasons why Hart is no great friend to our friend Jack Aubrey.
Exactly. I do love it here. Well, the First Lord slaps the table. I think he's sort of done with this. He says he doesn't think that $5 million is a trifling expense to the country, and he's bound by his legal advisors who have tied his hands, no matter how much he'd like to go along with Sir Joseph's, in many ways, excellent and convincing suggestion. He says, well, they can all console themselves knowing that there'll still be a considerable sum left to be divided among the naval men involved, and he moves to the next item on the agenda. So Sir Joseph's had his legs pretty much cut out from under him. You know, the First Lord is, I'm going to do what I was going to do when I came in for whatever reasons. And looking at the historical precedent that you mentioned earlier, Ian, you know, it didn't become droids of the crown. It actually became droids of the Admiralty. So, you know what? We're not going to pay them out. You know, my new administration, I'm going to start off 5 million pieces of aid richer. So, not good here. Well, Sir Joseph quiets down, sits back, and he thinks that this new First Lord is a fool, a mere politician, a pitiful figure alongside the other First Lords that Blaine has served, and many of them he served. None of them would have missed the point that they could have used enemy money to provide the example of 4 youngish post captains caught in a downpour of gold. You know, he's thinking to himself, usually only admirals amass fortunes. You know, there just aren't that many naval fortunes. And those admirals are getting it for actions that they don't participate in personally. So here are the people who are actually, you know, making the difference, benefiting. And then he thinks no First Lord, except possibly St. Vincent, would have made the question turn on party politics. So, boom, another strike against this First Lord. And none of them would have ever, and here we get the essence of it, as you've explained, he had blurted out the name of a secret agent. So many of O'Brien's novels are kind of you finish a book on one page, you turn the page, and it's 5 minutes later, or it might be a scene setting difference, but we're continuing on. But this, and this one does that, but completely flips everything, kind of the whole essence of where we were going, because Jack and Stephen, who had just incurred a real, all kind of shower of good things, now have incurred very heavy damage or potential damage in this meeting.
Oh, it's grim for Sir Joseph to be sitting there. It's grim for what it means for Jack and Stephen as well. Now, we're making, as you say, Mike, a big contrast between the strengths of Lord Melville, the previous First Lord, who really understood intelligence, and the current incumbent, who, as we say, is a mere politician. We also see the difference in their perception of Stephen Maturin. Sir Joseph values Dr. Maturin highly and appreciates the importance of keeping his identity undercover. The new First Lord hasn't got to know and value Maturin yet. We get reminded as well that Stephen has been an entirely selflessly motivated agent. He hasn't demanded a penny for his services. He's brought them intelligence that had, among other things, allowed the British Navy to deliver this crippling blow to Spain, who was due to come in on the war on the side of the French. We get reminded of this ruse that Sir Joseph and Lord Melville had to give Stephen this temporary commission to allow him to cut in on the prize money here. And now his name had been called out in this very broad kind of plenary gathering with all these different people around the table. No one who's at this table understands the need for discretion, thinks Sir Joseph. Not the officers, not the civilians, and certainly not the talkative politicians. There are admirals now calling out to each other, he says, hollering in sea voices. And Sir Joseph takes comfort that the meeting is now out of control, and all of this huffing and hawing and hollering might actually cover over in people's memories this very particular unfortunate revelation that's been made about Stephen's identity. But still, he said to himself, this is Sir Joseph, drawing the metamorphoses of a red admiral, egg, caterpillar, chrysalis, and imago on his pad. What shall I say to him when we meet? What kind of face can I put on it when I see him? And that's a really anxious moment for somebody who is accustomed not to having to be anxious in quite this way.
Right.
And it's quite a sort of cinematic moment as well, that we're kind of zooming in over Sir Joseph's shoulder, looking at the doodles on the blotter in front of him. He's also thinking about, the idea of growth and evolution. A butterfly starts as an egg and then turns into something beautiful. And then, maybe there's a bit of foreshadowing going on here, tying together Stephen and Sir Joseph with all these possibilities about where the life cycle of a spy might end up. Mike, we're going to talk a lot about this in this chapter of this book, but this is an example of what our friend Steve Morris would call a plant, an idea that's been lodged with us early in the story, only to be paid off at some time much later on. So, first of many plants is Joseph and Stephen, identity and changing identity that we get here. So, Mike, before we leave this gathering of all these noble men, and before we finish regretting the absence of Lord Melville, how close do we think this was to what really happened with the changing of the First Lord back in whenever it was, 1802?
It's interesting. It really, this Henry Dundas, same name as we've got in the story, first Viscount Melville from 1802. He's the Viscount, and there was a real inquiry. It had nothing to do with intelligence funds. It actually had to do with something that happened long before, when Melville was treasurer of the Navy. But O'Brien has used the inquiry for purposes of the story, despite it having happened for something else and the subsequent change in First Lords. He's also kind of played a little bit with the politics there, but he's drawing from real things and really working the continuity of the story nicely with them here.
Excellent. So in one of those classic moments here, we get a switch, right, from the fervid atmosphere inside the Admiralty boardroom to a different kind of atmosphere in a different kind of room.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this one maybe at the end of the episode, but it's such a fabulous example, I think, of like you say, O'Brien as a master of description, as a master of setting kind of the tone in a description that might otherwise kind of be missed. So, like you said, we're going from the Admiralty. We're now going to Sussex to see Stephen and Sophie together. But here's the paragraph that transitions. In Whitehall, back with the Admiralty, a gray drizzle wept down upon the Admiralty. But in Sussex, the air was dry and perfectly still. The smoke rose from the chimney of the small drawing room at Mapes Court in a tall, unwavering plume. 100 feet before its head drifted away in a blue mist to lie in the hollows of the downs behind the house. The leaves were hanging yet, but only just. And from time to time, the bright yellow rounds on the tree outside of the window dropped of themselves, twirling in their slow fall to join the golden carpet at its foot. And in the silence, the whispering impact of each leaf could be heard, a silence as peaceful as an easy death. And I'm just like, what, right? Goosebumps. And you're like, okay, I get it. Whitehall and Sussex, and what an easy death. And, you're talking about in plants and payoffs, listen now to what was such a nice, fabulous description. All the plants there whose payoffs are going to come for chapters, I will say, but also, in the next paragraphs as well here. Really incredibly well done. And then Stephen finishes the scene setting. So we've had just a description. We just said, the impact of each leaf, the silence as peaceful as an easy death. And Stephen then says, to transition from the description to our characters, at the first breath of a wind, those trees will all be bare, observed Dr. Maturin. So it's like, not only is it hanging on just, not only is it, some falling, but Maturin saying, yeah, as soon as there's just a breath of wind, those trees will all be bare. So, all the gold coins will be gone. Oh, man.
Oh, absolutely. Oh, man. Couldn't have put it better myself. Now, this is O'Brien, so this is not going to be a chapter of sort of unrelenting gloom and pessimism. We've got a little forward-looking sentiment here from Stephen Maturin, who says, yet autumn is a kind of spring too, for there is never a one but it is pushed off by its own next coming bud. So every time a leaf falls, in other words, there's another leaf ready to take its place. And death or loss makes way for new life. And he's talking to who? He's talking to Sophie. So he tells Sophie then that he's going to show her where in Catalonia she and Jack are to come, I guess, as his guests once the war is over. He's looking ahead to peace, and he's looking ahead to a time when Sophie and Jack can be together. And in a little moment of domestic bliss here, Sophie Williams is toasting crumpets over the fire. Such an English occupation. He's just already dined. Strange time of the day to be eating crumpets when you've just finished your dinner, but never mind. Stephen says, easy on the butter. I am already, he says, in a high state of grease. And we get this clearly on the food stains that are all over his neckcloth, his waistcoat, and his breeches. And he's reflecting on her beauty. He's looking at her lovely face, her complexion, her lips with a very cute little characterization of the tip of her tongue poking out between the lips as she's trying to get the crumpet toasted just right. And here's what O'Brien writes. He looked at her with great complacency, feeling an odd constriction at his heart, a feeling without a name. She was engaged to be married to his particular friend, Captain Aubrey of the Navy. She was his patient, and they were as close as a man and woman can be where there is no notion of gallantry between them, closer, perhaps, than if they had been lovers. And Mike, I love the definition of gallantry here. Gallantry means polite attention or respect that is given by men to women because that's seen as the correct way to behave towards a woman. Gallantry comes from the French word for ornamentation, which I think is a lovely root to this word. And as we've seen already in Post Captain, there are all these deep relationships and this particular kind of brother-sister relationship between Stephen and Sophie, and we're caught up hugely already, I think, by just that one paragraph about Stephen and Sophie as they're sitting here together.
Yeah, I'm completely with you, Ian. And if we need any proof that Stephen is not bound, in his behavior by gallantry, O'Brien gives it to us. Stephen admires the crumpet that she passes and says, it's going to have to be my last. And he says, I don't recommend any more for you either. You are getting too fat. So I think not something we'd see Sir Lancelot saying to Guinevere at any point here. But, Stephen adds, you're better than, your haggard and pitiful self less than 6 months ago. Obviously, marriage suits you. And then he gets very agitated when she starts to make another crumpet. And he says in various variations, which are humorous to read anyways, who's that for? Who are you making that for? For whom is that? He's going through. And Sophie says, showing that she's got this relationship thing too, that it's for her because Jack says that she is to be firm. I've got to eat lots of crumpets. And she explains he likes firmness of character. And I'm thinking, this is just getting better and better. And she starts to quote Jack, quoting Nelson, when a horn sounding from outside the house stops her, and they both turn to the window. And Stephen wonders out loud, have they killed their fox yet? So there's this fox hunt going on out there. And again, O'Brien takes us from this description of what it looked like outside to death. This description of, they're there in this peaceful, cozy thing, to the outside, to death of this thing. And Sophie's reaction is, well, I'm just glad Jack's not out there riding in the hunt. And she thinks about his mare and how the mare always throws him and he's likely to break a leg. So we keep coming back to all these things that are happening and it goes even deeper.
It's such good writing here. It's such a really delicious moment as well. Now, we're going to go back to the idea of trees and leaves falling as Stephen looks out of the window at the tree that he can see outside. What's the name of the tree, he asks, and Sophie names it as the pagoda tree. She says it's not a real pagoda tree, but that's what they call it. And she regrets instantly mentioning the pagoda tree because she knows where it might lead Stephen's mind, because the real pagoda tree is a tree that you find in India, and pagodas are small gold coins that resemble the leaves on the tree. So shaking the pagoda tree means, for an Indian expat, making a fortune, becoming a nabob, as they say. India, then, is going to be a touchy subject for Stephen because Diana, the object of Stephen's love, had eloped there with Canning, her lover and now keeper. And Sophie has to tread delicately here, even though the name of the black sheep, Diana, can't directly be mentioned at Mapes. They've heard a lot and talked a lot about this situation because the wealthy Canning has got interests in shipping, interests in the East India Company, interests in politics, so he's often in the papers. He, that is to say Canning, owns 3 rotten boroughs and has surrogate members sitting in for them because as Jews they can't sit in Parliament. Canning, furthermore, is high in the social world. He has friends among the Prince of Wales set, who were some of the folks that we saw in the Opera House at the end of Post Captain. And there are rumours from the neighbouring county where Canning's and his wife's cousins and his wife's family, the Mocatas and the Goldschmidts, live. Now, Sophie is treading delicately, trying to avoid hurting Stephen's feelings, but poor old Stephen is well across all of this. He knows far more about Diana than even the gossipy Williams family know. He knows the position of her cabin on the Indiaman, the ship that had taken her over. He knows the background of her maids, the number and amount of bills that she had left unpaid behind her in England. He knows the storm that is raging violently in the Canning, Goldsmith, and Mocata family because Mrs. Canning herself had no notion of a plurality of wives. So Canning is in trouble on the marital front. The storm that she had caused led Canning to leave for India with an official mission for him to take care of related to French establishments on the Malabar coast. That's the southwest coastline of India. A rare place, thinks Stephen, for gathering pagodas. So, Mike, Sophie's tried to sort of spare his feelings a little bit, but he's probing at this like somebody probing a sore tooth, isn't he?
No, it really is. The thoughts that Sophie feared do, in fact, fill Stephen's mind. But O'Brien tells us those thoughts are never far from his mind. They're there every morning when he wakes, and when they're not immediately present, he feels them like a physical pain in his midriff. O'Brien tells us that Stephen has files in a secret drawer in his desk with more intelligence on Diana and Canning than he has on any pair working in Bonaparte's intelligence service.
Wow.
Yeah, some of it came from benevolent sources, but most of it he's paid a mint of money, O'Brien tells us. He has, in O'Brien's words, spared no expense in making himself unhappy, making his position. Yeah, I'm with you, Ian. Making his position as a rejected lover even clearer. And Stephen is just there looking into the fire and he's thinking to himself, he's wondering, why do I gather these wounds? He says, well, it could be called a private war, so intelligence is helpful. That's what I do. And then he says, well, maybe it's to persuade myself that I'm still fighting, though I know I've really been beaten out of the field. But thinks, well, while that's rational, it's probably false. It's too glib, too superficial, too shallow. So Stephen's, now checked out, into his own thoughts. Sophie, meanwhile, is still sitting there with him.
Right. And she's thinking in this very domesticated framework that she has for thinking of him. He looks in need of darning, in need of a bit of a patchwork job. He needs someone to look after him. And she has a low opinion of his ability to look after himself. He's not fit to wander around the world alone. He is so hard to unworldly people. Now, there's an interesting question. Just how unworldly then is Stephen Maturin? Is he really not aware of the realities of life? Is he really not motivated by material or practical considerations? She thinks of Diana's behavior as being like hitting a child. And it's surprising because he's so learned, but not actually knowing very much. She thinks that if Stephen had simply cleared his throat and said to Diana, please be so good as to marry me, if he'd done that the previous summer, she would have gladly done so. And Sophie's final thought is, not that she would ever have made him happy, and then bitch was the word that struggled to make itself heard, but it struggled in vain. So, Sophie's clearly Team Stephen for all that she possibly can be here.
She is, and she's Team Stephen there, and she's thinking, we were having such a pleasant time before I spoke, and now the fire has gone out, meaning the fire between the two of them. Then she realized, well, and the real one has pretty much gone out as well. But then she reflects back on herself. She thinks how lucky she is to have Jack, and she pictures Jack cheerful, overflowing with life, direct and open affection, his amused laugh. She sees him in great detail and remembers how his bright blue eyes almost vanish when he laughs. Eyes bluer than the scarlet flush of mirth. And, this is Jack, and she's filling in all the other details about Jack and how he looks to her. And she thinks, she'd never had so much fun with anyone else. And speaking of fun,
here comes Mrs. Fun herself. Sophie's mother, Mrs. Williams, throws open the door, shouting very, very harshly, "What are you doing sitting alone in the dark?" And she goes on with this very, very kind of coarse line of, I don't know, banter or humor or something. She said she'd had her suspicions after the long silence. She had heard listening through the wall from the small drawing room. I can imagine it with the kind of glass, glued up to the wall there. The reactions on the faces of Stephen and Sophie convince her that she's wrong, that they are in fact innocent. She says it must be her good girl Sophie, concerned about wasting money on candles, and he's praising Sophie's qualities as a housekeeper, I guess, to Stephen Maturin, the man with the castle in Spain, who she thinks could do very well, not for Sophie, but for the youngest daughter, Cecilia. If the doctor had been sitting alone with Cecilia in the dark, she would not have broken in. She tells them the price of wax has gone up, so candles are expensive. And Cecilia would have done the same thing as Sophie. But if it had been Cecilia in the dark with a bow, that would never have done. The game would not have been worth the candle. And this is a very curious thing for Mrs. Williams to say. The game not worth the candle means it's not worth the time or the money. It kind of comes from the idea of gambling tables. If the stakes at the table are too small, then it's not even worth paying the money to have a candle to light your card table. And I don't think she really knows what this phrase means. She just thinks it's a sort of fancy-sounding phrase, and she's finding something to say to link her idea of parsimony and candle wax together somehow. But she can't stay for very long talking just about candles. She's got to talk about all the other things that she's shrewish and parsimonious about, right?
Right. She says that she's been talking with her man of business, trying to manage this large estate, going through the writings and the contracts and the settlements. And this man of business has been admonishing her for delaying one particular contract. And she says, well, it's not my fault, because Captain A has been so far away. And then we get a little bit of background here and a little catching up. The marriage negotiations have drawn out because Mrs. Williams will not part with, in O'Brien's word, with her daughter's virginity or her £10,000 until an quote unquote adequate provision, a binding marriage settlement had been signed, sealed, and above all, the hard cash delivered.
Right.
Jack had already agreed to all of Mrs. Williams' greedy conditions. He's tied up everything that he'll ever have for the benefit of his widow and his offspring. And, the contract's been written as if Jack was a pauper and anything he ever gets has to go there. But Mrs. Williams still will not move until the money, the cash, those banknotes of England are in her hands.
She's terrible, isn't she?
Right.
She is really terrible.
Right.
And of course, this is why even the ex gratia payment from the Lords of the Admiralty might not do very much over and above Jack's £11,000 debt to set him up as a potential suitor for Sophie. Now that they're alone again, Sophie tells Stephen that there's something that she wants to ask him, that she doesn't want to be ignorant about in front of Captain Aubrey. She also can't ask her mother. And Stephen, I think, presumes that this is going to be some terrible biological female confessional moment. And he says, of course, you can ask me anything as a medical man. She's a bit, what do you mean? Medical man. Anyway, never mind. Shut up. I want to know about the war, she says. Now, I remember back at the beginning of Post Captain, Sophie and her sisters and Diana all going to the library and reading the Naval Gazette and learning about larboard and starboard. And Sophie is trying to catch up again here with her knowledge, not just of the Navy, but of the global situation with the war. It's been so long since it all started, she says, and she hasn't paid particularly attention. She doesn't know who the enemies are. It would be very shocking, she says. Treason, no doubt, to put the wrong people in my prayers. It's very adorable that she's thinking of making sure she prays for the right people. She mentions the Papenburg the other day when Jack had mentioned using the Papenburg flag as a ruse de guerre, and all she'd been able to say was, Papenburg. And all those of us who recently remember our reading of Post Captain remember that back in Chapter 9 of Post Captain, Jack Aubrey did use the flag of Papenburg, this little tiny Bonaparte-leaning German city-state. He used this flag to get a moment to sail a little bit closer under false colours to the Bellon when the Polycrest was in action against the Bellon. Now, I love this moment because in a book by a lesser author, Stephen would then use this as a pretext for a load of story exposition. A bit like our old friend Basil exposition in the Austin Powers movies, if you're an Austin Powers fan. But it is going to form a little bit of that. But essentially, Stephen sort of blows it off. He's very unhelpful to Sophie. He lists the names of all the countries, doesn't really explain very much about who they are, except that some of their allegiances have changed. He reminds Sophie and us of the importance of naval power. And maybe he uses this little expository moment to remind us that we're still in pre-Trafalgar days, when he talks about Nelson blockading Toulon and trying to intervene with the French and the Spanish fleets joining up here. Remember, 1804 seems to be where we are in the timeline. The Battle of Trafalgar is coming in the autumn of 1805.
Nice. Well put, Ian. That's good. And in saying that, he's telling Sophie, that's why Jack's over there with Nelson, beating up and down off Toulon. So it's like, finally, here we are, chapter 1. We haven't heard word 1 about Jack yet. He's with Nelson beating up and down off Toulon. And Stephen says, I'm going to join them there as soon as I settle some business in London and buy some madder, M-A-D-D-E-R. I'm thinking, what's the matter? Sorry. All right. Right. Yeah. What's the matter to you? Right. A red pigment used in paint and ink. Tiny plant. Don't miss these. Right. So Stephen, stands to go over Sophie's protest. It's like, I'm joining, got to go, got to run. She brushes him down since he's grown less concerned about his clothes and appearance, O'Brien writes, since his disappointment, i.e. Diana. Well, he asked Sophie, have you had any messages for Jack? And she asked if it would be of any use to beg Jack to be prudent, to not take risk. Stephen says, well, I can mention it, but I will tell you that Jack is not an imprudent man, and adds the caveat, at sea. Amen to that, Stephen. Well done. Stephen tells her he loves his men and his ship too much to take risks that he hasn't weighed carefully. Well, she accepts that, and she says that everything just seems to take so long. And Stephen says, well, remember, Parliament's soon going to be over. Captain Hammond's going to be back with his ship. Jack will be thrown on the beach, and you can see him as much as your heart desires. She says, well, please send my dearest love. And then she tells Stephen, pray, take the greatest care of yourself, too. And I'm thinking, one, did I tell you again how much I love this friendship between Stephen and Sophie? But I'm also thinking, wait, there was all this thing about Jack taking care of himself. Stephen's in the operating room during these battles. Pray, take the greatest care of yourself too. Plant, might be a plant, who knows? All right, what do you think, Ian?
Well, Mike, I think we should celebrate the fact that we've managed to come all this way through all these plants and never once yet used the phrase stick a pin in it.
Right, that's right.
So stick a pin in that thought while we all go and grab ourselves a glass of something refreshing, and we'll be right back. Well, welcome back from the break. I hope you're keeping a running list somewhere in your little red book of all these plants, all these things that we're going to come back to in the story as it unfolds here. And we're going to go all the way back to our last recorded mention would have been chapter 13, I think, of Post Captain. Stephen is a naturalist with a particular love for entomology, for insects, you might say, for beetles. And his next appointment in London is at the Entomology Society. You might also, by the way, want to cast your mind back to the feeling that Sir Joseph Blaine had at the end of the Admiralty meeting, thinking, what am I going to do when I next meet Stephen Maturin? Well, we're going to find out. Stephen enters the Entomological Society. By the way, Mike, I've got no idea whether the Entomological Society was a real thing or not, but we'll come back to some more about the world of naturalists in a second. And at the beginning of this meeting, as Stephen walks in, the Reverend Dr. Lamb, who we'll come back to, is beginning his paper on a new species of beetle. But as everybody had suspected he would, this guy Lamb quickly diverts away from beetles to haranguing the gathering on his pet theory of the hibernation of swallows. And again, we'll come back to that. Let's just stay with Stephen's point of view for a minute as he looks around the room. Stephen's picking out people he knows in the audience. There's somebody called Dr. Musgrave. There's somebody called Mr. Tolston. There's somebody allegedly a learned Swede called Eusebius Piscator. And having seen all of these people, all these men he recognizes, Stephen stops at the sight of a familiar plump back and a powdered queue, a powdered ponytail, for want of a better word, a back that is almost as recognizable as a face, and the face is turned away from him. The back is all he can see. It's turned in an odd, unnatural twist, with the left hand raised, resting on the jaw as if to shield his face. And Stephen's not fooled by this at all. He knows precisely who it is, and he says to himself, in all their dealings, he had never seen Sir Joseph write himself into such an attitude. And Stephen, bless him, is totally unaware of what emotions might be coursing through Sir Joseph's bosom at this point, and we're going to find out about that in a moment. There are two interesting references and a really fascinating reference. The kind of interesting ones are Musgrave, that appears to be taken from the name of a real scientist, but an anachronistic reference. There's a guy called Anthony Musgrave, who was an Australian entomologist born at the end of the 19th century. The second name, Tolston, I can't find anybody named Tolston until the middle of the 19th century, and they're all Americans from the southern states. So maybe this name Tolston doesn't correspond to a scientist. Perhaps it's a slightly ironic play on the earlier married name of Mary O'Brien, who was Mary Tolstoy. And of course, O'Brien's stepson was Nikolai Tolstoy, still is Nikolai Tolstoy. The really fascinating one is coming. I quite like as well the third one here, Eusebius Piscator. There is no Swedish entomologist called Eusebius Piscator that I've been able to track down. This name seems to be a reference to a 17th century work of literature, two 17th century works of literature here. Forgive me for a minute while I build up the picture here. There was a book called The Complete Angler, a very, very famous book on the pleasures and philosophy and practicalities of fishing by a guy called Isaac Walton. It was written in the 1650s. And in this book, one of the characters or narrators or protagonists is somebody called Piscator, a Latin word meaning fisherman. This book, The Complete Angler, has bizarre parallels with another work of about the same time by Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle, the chemist, he of Boyle's law, the one who derived the relationship between temperature, pressure, and volume. Robert Boyle was, by the way, an angling enthusiast and also a bit of an amateur philosopher. And in the 1650s, he too wrote a treatise. This was on philosophy called Occasional Reflections Upon Several Subjects. Not exactly a barnstorming title for a book, but he published it. And the main character was someone called Eusebius.
Whoa.
And I found at least one reference online to people going, there are parallels. The structure and the story and the character and the way characters and narration are used to make a philosophical point are very, very similar between the two books. It doesn't seem that these two books were inspired by each other, but they followed this bizarrely similar pattern, Boyle's book and Walton's book. And this is the only connection I can find after several hours of rabbit hole internet Googling. The only connection I can find between Eusebius, the character in Boyle's book, and Piscator, the character in Isaac Walton's book. I've got a link to an article that talks about this. I shall pop it out on the social media, and you can scratch your head over it as much as me. Now, Mike, I've got one more, and this is the really fascinating one. This guy Lamb appears not to have existed with that name, but the character of Dr. Lamb and his particular obsession in life as a naturalist seems to be based on the work of the 18th century naturalist Gilbert White. And Gilbert White, in the same way as our fictional Dr. Lamb here, had this bizarre belief in the migration of swallows. At least it seems bizarre to us now. It seemed bizarre to quite a few other people, including some of the members of the society that Stephen was sitting with there. Gilbert White corresponded, among other people, with our old friend Sir Joseph Banks, and he was known in scientific circles as a very rational, very evidence-based observer of the habits of beetles and birds. So it was kind of odd that he clung to this idea of swallows hibernating for such a long time in the face of so little evidence. There's a lovely essay online by a writer, an author called David Quammen, who writes about the slightly strange nature of Gilbert White's obsession with the the hibernation of swallows, including them diving underwater, which is mentioned in O'Brien's text here. And right at the end, there's this delicious literary wrap-up, and I'll read it out for you. White's mistake about swallow hibernation was an uncharacteristic lapse. He had ulterior reasons, I think, for keeping the idea alive. These reasons pertain not to the ecology and behavior of Hirundo rustica, which is the name for a swallow, but to the natural history of the human soul. The swallow that hibernates underwater is a creature called yearning.
Wow.
And that's a beautiful close to that insight into the mind of Gilbert White. And what a parallel with Stephen. You know, how much is Stephen yearning for things that he would wish to be true to indeed be true, despite what cold hard facts he's learned in his dossier of intelligence about Diana and Canning and which ship and where in India he's off to.
Nice.
It's delicious, and it's just a great reward for digging a little bit behind one of his references here. Anyhow, Mike, I'm sorry, I've taken up enough time. I've talked about the entomologists. I've talked about White. I've talked about hibernating swallows. We have to get back into the room as this Lamb/White guy finally wraps up.
Yeah. Much to the delight of everybody there. You know, Lamb finishes up, and the chairman says, well, we're now too short on time to read all the papers that were scheduled, but I'd like especially to call Sir Joseph Blaine to read his remarks on a true gynandromorph, recently added to his cabinet. You know, there's that butterfly connection again, right? This is the butterfly that Stephen had given to Sir Joseph at the end of Post Captain. Sir Joseph half rises, begs to be excused, says he left his notes behind, doesn't feel well, and begs their pardon as he retires. And he kind of scoots out of the room. And Stephen wonders what to make of this as Sir Joseph passes him with a distant bow. He has a feeling that he knows, you know, a little presentiment, a foreboding, and he's thinking about that foreboding, you know, while the next person is reading their paper, until finally Stephen just walks out, and on the street, a discreet messenger stops him and hands him a card with a cipher, which Stephen translates in his mind, and it's an invitation to come to Sir Joseph's little house behind Shepherd Market, not to his official apartment, a place Stephen has never been to before.
Wow. Mike, in the Q&A last week, we were talking about how I like Sir Joseph, and one of the things that I remember from first encountering him is this description of his private place in Shepherd Market, a slightly bizarre set of things to focus on. Cases of butterflies. We always knew that Sir Joseph would have cases of butterflies, alternating with pornographic pictures on the wall. Nothing says natural. It's like nudie pictures on the wall. Never mind. Sir Joseph, despite all these things that are meant to set him at ease, is clearly actually ill at ease with Stephen, whom he thanks repeatedly for having come. He would really love to give a private explanation. He was prepared to do so on official territory the next day, but was thrown off by the sight of Stephen at the entomology meeting. There's been a grave indiscretion, he says, at the Admiralty, Stephen's name having been mentioned and insisted upon in connection with the treasure ships. Stephen doesn't seem to be terribly taken aback by this. He gives a little bow, and Sir Joseph goes on to describe the measures that he'd taken, how he had drowned the indiscretion immediately with all the kind of hubble-bubble in the meeting, and had circulated later on that Stephen was bound for an undefined eastern region in a scientific or quasi-diplomatic capacity, which would require this temporary commission for his status and for eventual negotiations. So well done improvising there, Sir Joseph. He reassures Stephen that he managed to make the claim that the connection between Stephen and treasure ships was purely fortuitous. He had made this story far more secret in their ears than the treasure interception being not to be divulged. So he had told the soldiers and sailors at the meeting, on no account talk about Stephen's secret diplomatic scientific mission to the east, thereby guaranteeing that they'd all go out and spread rumors. So he knows a thing or two about managing personalities. And this sounds like bad news for Stephen, Mike.
Well, it does. And Sir Joseph, too, is feeling it. He says, however, despite all my efforts, Stephen, your cover is somewhat blown, and that calls our whole program into question. Well, Stephen asks who's there, and he's taking this list and starting to read over who's present. And he says coldly, there is a strange levity, a strange, weak irresponsibility in playing with men's lives and a whole system of intelligence in this matter. So as he's thinking about everybody the First Lord has to this meeting where this is going to be discussed, this is his reaction. And Sir Joseph agrees that it's completely monstrous. And he says it's partly his fault. He had sent the First Lord some intelligence minutes, the ones in the yellow cover, counting on his discretion. And he says, I think I just got too used to a chief, i.e. Melville, that I could rely on. And he notes that a parliamentary government is just hopeless for intelligence. All these new men, all these politicians, civilians now coming into these meetings. He says a dictatorship is much better for intelligence. Bonaparte, he says, is far better served than His Majesty in England. And I have to say, Sir Joseph, I admire you, but I have to beg to differ with you and point out that whether a dictatorship is better for intelligence depends on the dictators. Some are, some are better at keeping confidential documents confidential.
Oh, Mike, I can't think what you could possibly be talking about now. Well, it's funny. Stephen is at this terribly, terribly low ebb, but he's managing to sort of bubble along this kind of air of fortitude. And I think it's just all a bit of a put on thing. The second issue that they get to is how the Admiralty Board had treated the treasure of Droits of the Crown. And here, Stephen starts to be quite kind of stern with Sir Joseph here. Sir Joseph said he had fought it, but the decision is irrevocable. And he hopes that knowing this a few days early might prevent Stephen from making some great financial commitment that he couldn't then get out of. And he knows that Stephen has another great interest in the matter, namely Jack, which is where Admiral Hart had been clumsily pointing in the opening paragraphs of the chapter here. And he says, I don't know how to express my regret with even 1/10 of the force that it requires. Stephen really appreciates the mark of confidence. And he says, I don't feel any emotion other than petty vexation, at least for the time being. But you will recall, he says, and now he's being quite stern, Jack Aubrey, my friend, is £11,000 in debt through no direct fault of his own. He needs to satisfy his fiance's mother. This was a deal that you and I put together so that I could make this particular thing happen for my friend. And he's basically saying, come on, there's got to be something else that you or the Admiralty can do to help me to make this right. And he colors in the picture a bit for Sir Joseph here, describing the mother-in-law, the mother of Jack's prospective bride. That's our Mrs. Williams, as here goes with this great list of epithets. A deeply stupid, griping, illiberal, avid, tenacious, pinch-fist lickpenny, a sordid lickpenny, and a shrew. There is no hope of marriage without his estate is cleared and he can make at least some kind of settlement upon her. Amen.
Well, Stephen says, what should I tell Jack when I join him in Minorca? Does Jack get anything at all from this action? And Sir Joseph says, well, there will be an ex gratia payment that will likely clear the debts, but the total amount will be far from wealth, far from what Jack would have been expecting. But Sir Joseph, hearing Minorca, asked Stephen if he intends to go forward with their original plan, despite this unexpected and unfortunate occurrence in the meeting. And Stephen said that he is. He's leaving tomorrow, and he doesn't think information like this or rumors like this will move as quickly as Stephen will. Stephen's determined to get there to get this job done. And he says there's only one name on the list that he's concerned about, a known pederast. And I want to pause again. I think we did this when we originally came across this. The current dictionary definition of a pederast is a man who engages in sexual activities with boys. But a number of sources suggest that at the time of this book, this word was probably used to refer to homosexuality rather than what we would refer to as pedophilia here. So hence then Stephen's commentary. He's saying, this man is a known pederast. And Stephen says, not that I have anything against pederastry myself. Each man must decide for himself where beauty lies, and surely the more affection in this world, the better. But it is common knowledge that some pederasts are subject to pressures that do not apply to other men. And here we're getting kind of, a little bit more about this is why Stephen's concerned about this person, and he has a plan here.
Right. And that's the two age-old cliches that are the cause of prejudice against gay men in services like this. First of all, the nonsense that they're a threat to people who are underage, and second of all, the idea that they're more prone to being blackmailed than anybody else. And that's been, I think, a theme in lots and lots of the literature of spying, sadly. O'Brien's not quite done with his saucy words about gay men. Stephen says that if this particular gentleman can have his meetings with La Tapeterie discreetly watched, and if La Tapeterie can be neutralized for a week, he has no hesitation in carrying on their former arrangement. He says, even without these particular precautions, it's no use sending anybody else. And he flings out a couple of names. No point, he says, in sending Osborne or Schikaneder to meet with Gomez. Gomez, he says, will put his head into no man's hands but mine, and without that contact, the new system falls to pieces. And Mike, the name choices again here are intriguing. This has been quite the chapter for digging into O'Brien's choices of names for incidental characters. There's no French personality, let alone spy, that I can find named La Tapeterie. If you go Googling the phrase, you'll discover that tapette is a vulgar French slang word that means a gay man. So O'Brien's indulging in a bit of prejudice and scatological humor here, perhaps. No idea who Osborne is or was. It's a very, very common name. Schikaneder might have a bit of a resonance for you if you can remember the reference to Mozart's opera The Magic Flute at the end of Post Captain. Now, Marriage of Figaro is O'Brien's sort of signature Mozart opera. We mentioned Magic Flute, though, because of its status in the performance where Stephen was in the opera house. Emmanuel Schikaneder, for it is he. Schikaneder was the dramatist and impresario who wrote the libretto for Magic Flute. Mozart actually died only a few weeks after the premiere of Magic Flute. Schikaneder was distraught at the news, felt the loss really acutely, and apparently put on a benefit performance of the Magic Flute as a testimonial, a benefit for Mozart's widow Constanza. So there's Schikaneder for you. I don't think there's any particular reason for the name other than it would have been at the front of O'Brien's mind. I can see it being on an index card somewhere within reach of his desk when he was writing this chapter.
Nice. Well, Sir Joseph doesn't like to think about Stephen running the added risk of continuing his current intelligence campaign, this mission. And Stephen says it's very slight, if indeed it exists at the moment, negligible. If I have a fair wind, and if you caulk this leak, this purely conjectural leak, for this one voyage, it does not weigh at all compared with all the common daily hazards of the trade. Afterward, if silly chatter still has its usual effect, clearly I shall not be useful for some time. Not until you rehabilitate me, with your quasi-diplomatic or scientific mission to the calm of Tartary. When I come back from it, I shall publish such papers on the cryptograms of Kamchatka that no one will ever set the mark of intelligence upon my head again. End of chapter 1.
Oh, excellent. Mike, great job there, getting your tongue around all of that. Help us out then. Who or what would have been the Kham of Tartary?
Well, yeah, Tartary is this part of Asia. At the time of the story and before, they had kind of limited knowledge of Manchuria, Siberia, Central Asia, and they just called the whole area Tartary. Later, they started breaking it down into units, and this Kham was the ruler. So the kind of the historical ruler of this section and the subsections here. So if and I think this is, Stephen's referring back to Sir Joseph's planted story about where, what Stephen was doing, why he had this temporary commission and everything, that he's going off to the wilds of Central Asia to do this negotiation here. Now, what I love, though, Ian, was this thing about, hold on, I shall publish such papers on the cryptograms. That sounds a little bit like something else to me, too.
It really does. It's a play on words that O'Brien clearly really loves. A cryptogram is a plant or a plant-like organism that doesn't produce seeds, that reproduces through spores. And coming from the ancient stem in Greek, hidden, kryptos, and to marry being gam. So that includes ferns, mosses, algae, and fungi. Cryptograms, on the other hand, with an R, are a piece of encrypted coded text that must be decrypted to reveal a message. And I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to say reach ahead into Desolation Island for another example of O'Brien teasing one of the characters with this play on words between cryptogam and cryptogram. Stephen is about to say farewell to Louisa Wogan on Desolation Island. And he says, I do not collect that we are to leave Desolation quite so soon. Captain Aubrey could never answer for it to the Royal Society were he to hurry me away before my collections were completed. And I am not halfway through the cryptograms. The cryptograms, sir? Cried Mrs. Wogan. No, child, said Stephen. Cryptograms. A cryptogram with another R to it is a puzzle, and the word is used for secret writing, I believe. Cryptogams are plants that produce offspring without any visible apparent marriage. So, well done. He's going to enjoy the play on words a few more times as well, I think.
Nice.
But Mike, what a great end to the chapter. What a great turnaround. Like you said, we were headed off in the direction of fortune for Jack, marriage for Sophie, but it's all been turned on its head in just a few paragraphs here.
Right. And Stephen also appeared to be set to become wealthy. And even though we had our reservation, he seemed to be at least partially dealing with the loss of Diana, certainly questioning if she was ever the woman that he'd made her out to be. And clearly, yeah, as you say, a dramatic turnaround. Now we see where he is with Diana now.
And it seems like, for all it seemed like we had learned pretty conclusively at the end of the previous chapter that Diana was gone and that Stephen's hopes for love were completely forlorn. He's back there again, and I don't think that we're going to have heard the last of Diana Villiers, and I'm sure it's not a spoiler to mention that now.
No.
Now, Mike, we've talked about plans and payoffs. This chapter is a really great example of how he's setting up at the beginning of the book. Not only people and events, but also themes and ideas that he's going to unravel and come back to much, much, much later in the book.
Absolutely agree. I mean, there's so many examples here, some of which we really can't talk about as much until we kind of get to the payoff. So I'm thinking, I see dead people. I'm thinking about the movie The Sixth Sense. And, so many things happen. And then beautifully at the end of the film, they go, let me show you. You saw this all along. You knew this. It was right there in front of you. And they roll back through key moments in the movie. And I'm feeling like with plans and payoffs that we want to do that now. Well, we'll start with perhaps one or two here. Think about Sir Joseph at the end of that Admiralty meeting, and he's thinking about, there's this gaffe that's happened, but maybe he's quelched it here. But as he's thinking that, he's drawing, as you had described, in this development of a butterfly from an egg all the way through its stages, except for the final stage. He doesn't draw a dead butterfly. But as he gets to that, he says to himself, but still, and it's that but still is it. It's this agent's name slipping out, just a tiny egg now, but look at how it could evolve. Look at how the stages may go. And clearly, we've got all kinds of links between Sir Joseph and Stephen as a butterfly. We've got all kinds of links between Stephen as the intelligence agent and the head of naval intelligence. So I think this is a real nice plan to say, we think we've got this nipped in the bud. Even Stephen seems to be pretty nonchalant. Let's hang in and see what happens. Maybe yes, maybe no. As we know with O'Brien, maybe we're going to be wealthy in the beginning of the next book. Maybe we won't.
Maybe not. We've noticed as well how O'Brien is going to set up ideas and places and the environment to set up at the beginning that we should watch out for being come back to all the way through the book and maybe also coming back at the end. So we opened in the Admiralty, and we also opened in the domestic setting. So if you appreciated that about Post Captain, you get a little reassurance that we haven't cut ties and left the shoreside life behind. We're here with the trees and the domesticity and the crumpets and that whole thing with Sophie is just beautiful. And it's setting up Sophie, I think, as a character that we can come back to. How is she and how is her relationship with Jack going to fare as whatever happens in this book is going to happen? Stephen is clearly not going to let his hopes for Diana go, although we're being encouraged to abandon any hope for Jack raising a dowry for Sophie. I don't think O'Brien would be mentioning it in chapter 1 here if there wasn't the chance that something could happen to bring Jack and Sophie back together.
Yeah, I keep thinking back to that in that thing exactly that you're talking about, and the way O'Brien set up that description here. Even with the things like the smoke, the air is still, it's perfectly dry, and the smoke rises. It's just rising way up there, but then it goes and settles back behind the house. The smoke is still there, ladies and gentlemen, even though it's not this gray wet drizzle of the Admiralty. It's still there. Oh, some of these gold leaves are falling of their own. What leaves? Later we get to the pagoda tree. Oh, those leaves that he was describing, they're the gold. The gold is falling away. And if there's a little wind, it's all going to be gone, says Stephen. Wait. Is this a plan? Is there going to be a payoff to this? What's going to happen with this money? Is there really an ex gratia payment? What's it going to be and everything? And all of this as peaceful as an easy death. Holy, and then we get, the fox death, all of this again, and we know O'Brien builds the tension, and for me, he's ratcheting up here. Let's remember all of this stuff. As peaceful as an easy death. Is all this money going away? Is this the death of Jack and Sophie's dreams, Stephen's dreams, some other death? What could be waiting for us? Perhaps even in the land of the pagoda tree, where, India. All right, we keep getting India references. India, Diana, Canning, Stephen here. It's just amazing. But then O'Brien always to say, now remember, it's not always the way you think it is. Autumn is a kind of spring. Each leaf is pushed off by its next coming bud. What does all this suggest about what may or may not be coming ahead? It leaves us wondering here.
It really does. And we've very discreetly had woven into this first chapter a reminder of Stephen as a naturalist and as a lover of nature. We've had plants and we've had beetles and we've had swallows and we've had butterflies. We should watch out, I guess, all the way through this book, like we have done through all the other books as well, how he's going to use animals and imagery to keep us engaged and keep us, in awe, I think, of his descriptive power. It's really good stuff.
We got all kinds of possibilities. What does the loss of this treasure mean to Jack? And how about even to Stephen? He told Sir Joseph, he was currently just feeling a little vexed, but he might be feeling different later. And we're also told he spent a mint of money tracking Diana down. And to what end?
Yeah, because, who knows? Maybe he thinks there's some kind of a spy deal going on here with Canning and Diana. Maybe he's just torturing himself with finding out more and more about the extent to which his love for her is doomed.
Right.
And speaking of doomed love,
yeah. What happens to Jack and Sophie? Is Mrs. Williams going to give in? Is Jack really going to be ashore and you can see all you want of him to your heart's desire? What about his debts? We know, all right, we're getting this drumbeat of, you got a very short time left on the Lively. Hammond's coming back. You're going to be thrown ashore. Can he go ashore if he's still in debt? Is this payment going to be made? When will it be made? What happens to him? Surely we don't have another bear suit or this time a hearse rolling down the coast with Jack lying in it to get to see Sophie. Do we?
Who knows? Mike, like we say, not only the plants that might pay off, but all the questions that we've got now about the characters and where we're headed with this story. I'm sure that we've got more to find out about the world that Stephen and Jack are going to be in. We've presumably are going to have Jack staying at sea because until he can get ashore and pay off his debts, then he's vowed that he's never going to set foot on shore. there was Catalan independence as well.
Right.
This whole intercepting of the treasure ships was meant to be a touchstone for Catalan independence, and I have no idea where Stephen's cause is gonna take him.
I think there's only one way to find out. What do you say next week to a little bit more Patrick O'Brien?
With all my heart. Blaine says, "Oh, he kind of blows a bit of sort of obscurity over it. We did it for Sir Joseph Blanks." Sir Joseph Blank.
There's WhatsApp. Boom.
We did it for Sir Joseph Banks. We did it for Edmund Halley, he of the Comet fame.